Chapter 27. Detective Power takes the stand. As the unmistakable hefty frame of Detective Power moved through the Kentville courthouse, admiring murmurs rippled through the crowd in his wake. So great was the anticipation of his testimony that the normally apathetic press gallery was filled to capacity, keening forward at full attention. It was the watershed moment of the trial, although not for the reasons many thought. In retrospect, Power's appearance was the instant in which the prosecution of Peter Wheeler truly became the persecution of Peter Wheeler. What gave Power's evidence such gravitas was that it carried the weight of a burgeoning new field of police work, the forensic sciences. It was a startlingly modern avenue ripe with potential, a highly technical discipline that would one day revolutionize criminal investigations. Unfortunately for Peter Wheeler, that day was still decades off. As Power took the stand, he was borne aloft solely by the promise and the hype. This being the Victorian era, such ethereal supports proved sufficient. Jurors, judges, and lawyers alike had yet to witness the full power and emotional resonance engendered by the scientific analysis of physical evidence. Its very newness made forensic material so compelling. The hallmark of the age was innovation and technological advancement. Science, engineering, and medicine had all grown by astronomical leaps and bounds in the past decades. Each new gadget, invention, or discovery was heralded as a cutting-edge breakthrough, a modern-day marvel that would change life as the Victorians knew it. Embedded in this industrial revolution was the public expectation that anything driven by scientific inquiry was inherently good, unquestionably reliable, and absolutely correct. Such naivete provided the perfect breeding ground for a wave of medical quackery, in which any device powered by the newly introduced phenomenon of electricity could boast miraculous curative properties for everything from dandruff to hysteria and find a receptive and lucrative market. This widespread predisposition toward all things scientific spilled over into the courtroom. If medicine and engineering were experiencing such an unprecedented renaissance, why not policing? The pump was primed, all Power needed to do was throw the switch. The public's willingness to accept scientific advancement without question was aided and abetted by the full-throttle media campaign that portrayed Power as a master sleuth. Accounts of his deductive tours de force were almost daily occurrences in the maritime press. The coupling of Canada's premier investigative mind with the latest in scientific innovation proved too intoxicating a combination to be ignored. Every news outlet dispatched a representative to capture the combustible mix for their readers and in prose that enthralled even those with the most fallow imaginations. Through luck if not volition, the Kentville courthouse had become ground zero for the forensic sciences in Canada. Time past and time present collided in the witness dock, coalescing in a veteran detective brandishing the latest weapon in the fight against crime. Dressed to impress in his finest regalia, a curious blend of gentleman's suiting accented with pseudo-military embellishments, Power looked more like the dictator of a banana republic than a police officer. As always, he spoke in the stentorian tones of someone long accustomed to being obeyed, a formidable presence who acquitted himself with equanimity in times of peril and in times of peace. Once sworn in, the detective began with a general accounting of the case to date. He had arrived in Bear River in the late morning of Wednesday, January 29, having been personally summoned by the Solicitor General. Immediately upon disembarking from his train, Power met with J.M. Owen, the acting prosecutor for Annapolis County. After getting some points to work upon, Power began his investigation. Based solely on his consultation with the prosecutor, Power was already of the mindset that Wheeler was the killer. Just the day before, the coroner's inquest had exposed Peter's supposed machinations to get the poor girl alone. The most pressing issue that remained was figuring out when the dastardly act was done. According to Power's own testimony, it appeared to the detective, after hearing the numerous theories, that if she was killed by Wheeler, the atrocious crime must have been committed between the hours of 5 and 6 o'clock on Monday evening, as it was shown clearly that he was seen going in the direction of the house about that time. By advocating such a timeline, Power had committed one of the cardinal sins of police work, bending the facts to fit the theory, rather than generating a theory based on facts. To support this time frame, Power offered a number of observations. Dr. Ellison may have had scientific rigor on his side, but Power had his own triad of evidence. First, there was the matter of the unmilked cow. Had Annie survived until its usual milking time, 6 p.m., Power argued the cow would have not produced so much milk the next day. Second, there was the issue of the beans. The detective claimed he had found a dish of beans set in the oven, as though Annie were warming them for a dinner she tragically did not live to enjoy. That the beans were more likely leftovers from her evening meal, rather than an untouched dinner, was a scenario never presented. Finally, there were the tissue paper flowers. In his statement to the coroner, Wheeler said that when he spoke with Annie near her house at 5 o'clock, she was planning on making paper flowers for a party being held in town that evening. This corroborated the testimony of a shop owner, William Rice, who had sold her the tissue paper at around 4 that afternoon. Power, however, noted that there were no flowers present and the package of tissue paper sat unopened in the parlor, another indication Annie was dead by sunset. In the high-stakes poker game that was Annie's time of death, Power saw the coroner's mortis sisters and raised him a cow, some tissue paper, and a hill of beans. A number of compelling points further contradicted the detective's theory of the crime. To begin, Annie was found in her nightclothes, wearing a red wrapper or housecoat, suggesting it was much later in the evening when the murder took place. This notion gains credence from the fact that Annie's bed was unmade and appeared to have been recently slept in, as if she were awakened in the night by her assailant. There was also the testimony of Walter Camo, who had seen Annie alive at 7 p.m., and Hardy Benson, who had seen a light come on as he and Wheeler left the Kempton house, indicating Annie was still alive until at least 8 p.m. Another witness, John Brooks, had seen the blinds open and a lamp burning in the Kempton house at 11 that night. Finally, there was the testimony of Dr. Ellison, whose autopsy revealed Annie's time of death to be the wee hours of Tuesday morning. The troublesome timeline had plagued Power from the very start, but under oath he stuck to his guns, arguing adamantly that the crime had occurred between 5 p.m. and 6 p.m. Power's obstinacy balanced on a single point: he could only place Peter Wheeler alone near the Kempton home at that time and no other. To concede the crime occurred at a later hour would be to concede Wheeler was not the killer. Unwilling to make such concessions, Power skillfully maneuvered the line of questioning to a more agreeable topic: himself. The detective's celebrity was built on what he considered to be his trademark, his savant-like ability to unearth and interpret the physical evidence of a crime scene. In his humble opinion, Power told the court, he had a way with clues. He could see what others missed or dismissed as insignificant. If there was a scrap of evidence, no matter how trivial or concealed, Power would sniff it out and discern its true meaning. To hear him tell it, the truth lay dormant at every crime scene, waiting for someone with the proper skills, presumably Power, to seek it out. Initially, evidence might be misinterpreted but never for long and never by him. In short, the court simply needed to trust in Power and his abilities, without question or equivocation. The detective had executed a near-perfect courtroom burlesque, simultaneously sidestepping the holes in the case while unabashedly blowing his own horn, and he nimbly set the stage for his big finish. Since his arrival in Bear River, Power had baited the press with tantalizing hints, thinly veiled allusions to all the incontrovertible proof that would seal Wheeler's fate. Eager to dispense with the treacherous quagmire that was the timeline, Power dove headfirst into a recitation of what the press had dubbed his perfect chain of evidence. The first link in this unalloyed chain was the pesky matter of those footprints in the snow, infamously introduced at the coroner's inquest by Bernard Parker. Parker had reiterated his interpretations for Purdy and again for the grand jury, yet it fell to Power to link those snowbound tracks directly to the accused. There were certainly obstacles to overcome. Omer Rice, a neighbor of the Kemptons and the first on the scene after Wheeler discovered the body, testified, "I think Mr. Kempton wears larrigans. A great many people in that section of the country wear larrigans in the wintertime and one larrigan track looks just like another." Rice made some valid points. Larrigans were ubiquitous and indistinguishable, and Detective Power responded the way he always did, through misdirection and showmanship. When he took Wheeler into custody, Power seized his clothing and his winter boots, a pair of larrigans. The detective then conducted an experiment of his own design to test whether Wheeler's boots had made the tracks in the snow behind the Kemptons' pig barn. Power took the larrigans behind the barn, put them on his gloved hands and pushed them into the tracks, declaring, "They fitted the marks perfectly in length and breadth." Queried by the defense, Power was forced to admit that he made the comparison several days after the murder, and in the interim, it had snowed several times. Smug as a well-fed house cat, Power explained that he overcame such difficulties by using a broom to sweep away the newer snow, exposing the older prints beneath. It is at this point that the heads of modern-day crime scene analysts explode. Despite Power's bravado, there was nothing about his so-called experiment that was scientifically valid or methodologically sound. Snow is an inherently unstable medium. It compacts and morphs over time and in response to oscillating temperature, gusting winds, or exposure to sunlight. In the 60-plus hours between the crime and Power's test, the prints were irrevocably altered. Furthermore, the additional snowfalls could not simply be swept away with a broom, an approach guaranteed to result in more damage than swept away with a broom, an approach guaranteed to result in more damage than benefit to the print's survival. Finally, there is the feasibility of the test itself. Larrigans are soft-soled shoes, which readily conform to the appendages they contain. That Power thought his hands were comparable to Wheeler's feet showed a serious lapse of judgment. It also goes without saying that a soft-soled moccasin, worn on a hand, could easily be made to fit into a malleable substrate such as snow, which immediately conforms to any object pressed into it. Power's test proved only that snow is a highly accommodating medium and that some juries will believe anything couched in the guise of science. Power had pushed a pliant shoe into soft snow and declared it a match, and in so doing had both condemned Wheeler and set the development of the forensic sciences back several decades in the process. Having single-handedly tarnished the as yet invalidated science of footprint comparison, Power then set his sights on blood spatter analysis. When Power seized Wheeler's boots, he also took possession of the prisoner's coat, pants, and shirt. As Wheeler relinquished his clothes, he mentioned there might be blood on some of the pieces, an artifact of his recent hunting expeditions. He also mentioned that his favored quarries were rabbit and fowl. Power scoured the clothing and found what he thought were bloodstains on one pant leg and on the heel of a sock. The eagle-eyed detective also saw evidence that Wheeler had tried to wash away the blood. In a rare moment of humility, Power acknowledged during this testimony that differentiating human from animal blood exceeded his normally boundless abilities. Seeking an expert opinion, the detective had submitted the pants and sock to an analyst in the Halifax PD, a man by the name of McIntyre, who confirmed Power's suspicion that blood was present on the pants but was unable to say definitively whether it was human. The analyst recommended a local doctor with training in microscopy who might be able to offer a more definitive conclusion. After obtaining an order from the Attorney General to conduct further testing, Power took the soiled items to Dr. Jacques in Halifax. The detective then told the court that he would leave it to the good doctor to explain his findings. The prosecution rested the witness, opening Power to cross-examination. Defense attorney Henry Ruggles battled valiantly to find the chinks in the detective's armor, working Power like a prizefighter unable to land the knockout blow. Ruggles did get Power to admit that he had not made any notes at the crime scene and had failed to note the condition of the room and the location of key pieces of evidence. Actually, Power had spent very little time at the scene itself. The detective arrived in Bear River more than 30 hours after Annie's body was first discovered, by which time the scene had been highly contaminated by family, friends, and the local police. Power's primary source of information regarding the scene was Charles Dunn, the detective from the Amherst agency, who was among the first to view the body. When Power arrived, Dunn briefed him on the scene, handed over his meager investigative notes, and took his leave of Bear River and any further involvement in the case. Ruggles also chipped away at the detective's credibility by confronting him with inconsistencies in his testimony. When asked about the bloody handprints at the scene, specifically a bloody fingerprint on the spoon in the half-eaten jar of preserves near the body, the detective contradicted his prior statements to the press around the time of Lovett's inquest. When Ruggles pointed out Power's vacillation, the super sleuth conceded he did not remember whether he swore at the inquest as to finger marks on the spoon. Ruggles's hawkish efforts to refute Power's testimony ultimately failed. Dwight was hampered by his own inexperience with forensic science and bested by a nemesis convinced of his own infallibility. Onlookers saw Ruggles's questions as nitpicking, scurrilous attempts to discredit a highly decorated officer of the law. No one outside the defense table seemed at all troubled by Power's slipshod police work, questionable recall of key events, or poor documentation of the evidence. Even if Power had much of the science wrong, it was still science. He was still Detective Power, and all in attendance knew in their hearts that Wheeler was guilty. Ruggles's blustering struck the crowd as an exercise in futility. The defense counsel, having been frozen out of Lovett's inquest and the grand jury hearing and marginalized during Purdy's folly, desperately wanted to have it stay in court. The problem was the forensic science, a discipline about which Ruggles knew nothing. Detective Power knew even less, but his elephantine ego prevented him from admitting as much. In fairness to both men, few in Canada had any background in forensic investigations, but thanks to an American satirist by the name of Mark Twain, virtually everyone knew a little something about one cutting-edge forensic technique, fingerprints.